A Winter's Proposal. A Billionaire Holiday Romance of Second Chances and Christmas Magic. By Wynne Valentine. Copyright 2024 by Wynne Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Wynne Valentine asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco. Audiobook by Google Play. Chapter 1, Return to Snowfall Ridge. Alex Gray's Aston Martin DB11 carved through the winding mountain roads like an obsidian blade, its high-performance tires gripping the snow-dusted asphalt with practiced precision. His knuckles whitened against the leather steering wheel, as another curve revealed more pristine wilderness. The car might handle the conditions perfectly, but his nerves were another matter entirely. Pine trees lined the route like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with fresh powder. The heated seats and climate control created a cocoon of warmth, but they couldn't quite chase away the chill that had settled in his chest since deciding to return to Snowfall Ridge. The Welcome to Snowfall Ridge sign emerged from the twilight, its wooden frame festooned with twinkling white lights and a thick garland of fresh pine boughs. Someone, probably old Mr. Henderson, had added a red bow this year. The sight hit him like a physical force, unleashing a flood of memories he'd kept carefully dammed up in the corners of his mind. Summer afternoons at the lake, homecoming bonfires, stolen kisses behind the general store. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, her last phone call still fresh despite being weeks ago. "The Evans farm is struggling, Alex. Clara's too proud to ask for help, but, well, you remember how much that place means to this town." She'd pause then, her next words hitting harder than any media criticism. Her grandmother would have wanted someone to look out for her. The truth was, he'd been looking for an excuse to escape the city's suffocating spotlight. Jessica's public breakup had simply provided convenient timing for what his heart had been pulling him toward since he'd first seen the financial notice article about the farm in his daily news alerts. He'd been tracking the farm's situation through local papers for months, each headline about declining tree sales or frost damage feeling like a personal blow. His phone erupted in a cascade of buzzes, the screen lighting up with notification after notification. Tech billionaire Alex Gray dumped at charity gala. Jessica Mitchell speaks out. He was married to his work. Gray Enterprises CEO goes dark after public breakup.
"For God's sake,"
he muttered, jabbing the silent button with more force than necessary. The headlines disappeared, but their echo remained, like a migraine he couldn't shake. Main Street unfolded before him, somehow both smaller and exactly as he remembered. Henderson's bakery glowed warm and inviting, the display window showcasing an elaborate gingerbread village. The same brass bell tinkled above Marlowe's Antiques as a young couple emerged, arms laden with wrapped packages. 10 years of building a tech empire, and this place hadn't changed a single brick. The town square slowed his progress to a crawl. A small crew wrestled with an enormous evergreen, directing it into position with shouts and gestures. Alex's throat tightened as he watched them work. He'd helped put up that tree his senior year, though helped might have been generous. He'd spent most of the time stealing glances at Clara as she wrapped strings of lights around the lower branches, her cheeks pink from cold and laughter. A volley of snowballs exploded against the bakery's wall, followed by shrieks of childish delight. A group of kids darted between parked cars, armed with fresh ammunition. Alex watched them through his tinted windows, feeling like a ghost observing a scene from his own past life. How many winter afternoons had he spent exactly like that, until homework and college applications began to take precedence over play? He could almost taste the hot chocolate his mother would have waiting, smell the cinnamon cookies cooling on the rack. The Snowfall Inn rose before him, its Victorian architecture softened by fresh snow and decorated with cascading icicle lights. The old building looked like something from a Christmas card, almost too perfect to be real. Alex parked in the back, grabbed his leather weekend bag and made his way to the entrance, head down and collar up. Maybe if he was lucky.
Alex Gray as I live and breathe.
So much for luck. Mrs. Thompson beamed at him from behind the check-in counter, her silver hair arranged in the same neat bun she'd worn when he was in high school. Her smile was warm enough to melt permafrost, and he noticed the same holiday brooch she wore every December pinned to her cardigan.
Mrs. Thompson. You're looking well.
He managed a genuine smile, despite himself, remembering how she'd always slipped him extra cookies during study sessions in the inn's common room.
Oh, none of that Mrs. Thompson business. It's still Betty to you, young man. Though I suppose I should be calling you Mr. Gray now with all your success.
She winked as she processed his check-in.
Your usual room is all ready.
His usual room. As if he'd just been gone a weekend, instead of a decade. The brass key she handed him was still attached to the same wooden snowflake keychain. The room was exactly as he remembered. Knotty pine walls, handmade quilt on the king-size bed, picture window overlooking the mountains. Alex loosened his tie and watched the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The view could have graced any luxury resort's brochure, but the peace it offered felt like a foreign language he'd forgotten how to speak. His penthouse in the city had a view too, but it was all steel and glass, nothing like this untamed beauty. His Armani suits and cashmere sweaters looked ridiculous as he hung them in the rustic armoire. His fingers brushed something soft at the bottom of his bag, his old Snowfall Ridge high school sweatshirt, worn thin at the elbows. He didn't remember packing it. He didn't remember keeping it. The faded mascot seemed to mock him with its cheerful expression. The TV hummed to life with local news, and Alex froze mid-motion. Clara Evans filled the screen, standing among rows of Christmas trees at her family's farm. She wore a red plaid coat he didn't recognize, but her knit hat was the same one he'd given her the Christmas before he left for college. Snow dusted her auburn hair where it escaped the hat's confines, and her smile was exactly as he remembered, warm, genuine, and just a little bit crooked. His heart performed the same uncomfortable flip it had done in high school.
The Evans family Christmas tree farm has been a Snowfall Ridge tradition for over 50 years,
she was saying to the reporter.
We're hoping for another great season.
Alex clicked off the TV and poured 3 fingers of scotch from his travel flask. The familiar burn couldn't quite drown out the sound of her voice. He stood at the window, watching Christmas lights blink to life across town like earthbound stars. The life he'd built in the city felt distant and unreal, like a movie he'd watched rather than lived. The empire he'd created, the wealth he'd amassed, none of it had filled the hollow space that opened in his chest whenever he thought of this place. Of her. Of everything he'd left behind in his rush to become someone else. His phone buzzed again. Victor's name flashed on the screen, along with 3 missed calls he'd been ignoring.
The vultures are circling, Alex.
His business partner said without preamble.
Every gossip rag in the country is trying to spin this breakup into the next big scandal. We need to get ahead of this. Where are you?
Alex watched a young couple stroll past the inn, hands clasped and heads bent close together. Their laughter drifted up through the winter air.
Taking some personal time.
Personal time? Now? The board meeting is in 3 days, and the Palmer acquisition.
Handle it.
Alex ended the call, dropping his phone onto the dresser with a clatter. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a punctuation mark on his past life. The scotch burned going down, but it did nothing to warm the cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. He'd come here seeking refuge, but standing in this room, surrounded by memories of a simpler life, he felt more exposed than ever. Chapter 2, Clara's Christmas Tree Woes. Clara's fingers traced the worn grooves in her grandmother's old oak desk, following the familiar patterns where countless Christmas tree receipts had been written over decades. The evening sun cast long shadows through the farmhouse office window, highlighting the dusty air and the overwhelming stacks of papers that had become her constant companions.
This can't be right,
She muttered, double-checking the inventory report for the third time. The numbers didn't lie. Frost damage had claimed nearly half of this year's crop. With trees taking 7 to 10 years to mature, losing this many meant the farm's income would be impacted for years to come. The bank wouldn't wait that long for their money. Clara's chest tightened as she opened the leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with her careful handwriting, tracking every expense and dwindling income. The familiar scent of leather and paper reminded her of countless nights spent at this very desk with her grandmother, learning the business that had sustained their family for generations. The red figures jumped out at her like accusations. She'd tried everything to save those trees: extra coverings, intensive care, even that expensive new irrigation system that had eaten through her emergency fund. Now, watching those investments quite literally freeze before her eyes felt like a personal failure. Her grandmother would have known exactly what to do, but Clara was stumbling through on her own. Pushing back from the desk, Clara grabbed her heavy coat and headed out to the fields. The December air bit at her cheeks as she trudged through the snow, checking each row of surviving trees. Her boots crunched over frozen ground as she adjusted protective covers and examined needles, trying not to look too long at the brown, brittle remains of what should have been this season's prime stock. The sweet scent of pine needles mixed with the crisp winter air, a combination that usually brought her comfort but now only reminded her of everything she stood to lose.
just hold on.
She whispered to a particularly vulnerable sapling, tucking its cover more securely around its base. Her grandmother used to say every tree had a fighting spirit. Clara just wished that spirit came with a guarantee. She remembered helping plant this very batch last spring, full of hope and determination. Now those memories felt like mockery. Her grandmother used to say every tree had a fighting spirit. Clara just wished that spirit came with a guarantee. She remembered helping plant this very batch last spring, full of hope and determination. Now those memories felt like mockery. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention back to the farmhouse. The mail carrier's truck was pulling away, and Clara's heart sank. These days the mail never brought good news. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice warning her not to borrow trouble before it arrived, but experience had taught her otherwise. Sure enough, the bank's logo glared up at her from the top envelope. Clara's hands shook as she tore it open, though she already knew what it would say. The words, "Notice of foreclosure," sent a wave of nausea through her stomach. In a burst of frustration, she crumpled the paper and hurled it across the room, watching it bounce off the wall where a family photo hung crooked. The last Christmas photo they'd taken with her grandmother, everyone smiling around the perfectly decorated tree they'd cut together. Immediately, guilt and practicality won out. Clara retrieved the wrinkled notice, carefully smoothing it against the desk before adding it to her urgent pile, which had grown so large it could hardly be called a pile anymore. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders, like a physical burden.
Clara Marie Evans.
Margie's voice rang through the house, accompanied by the slam of the screen door.
Don't tell me you're still wearing yesterday's clothes.
Clara glanced down at her dirt-stained jeans and wrinkled flannel, suddenly aware she hadn't changed since, when was it? Yesterday morning? The days had started blending together, in her desperate attempt to keep everything running. Margie burst into the office, her blonde curls bouncing and her arms laden with what looked like half her bakery's inventory. The scent of fresh baked goods filled the room, making Clara's stomach growl traitorously. "I brought reinforcements," she announced, setting down 2 steaming travel mugs and a box that smelled suspiciously like her famous double chocolate peppermint cookies.
I'm fine, Marge. Just busy with end-of-year inventory.
Clara tried to casually slide the bank notice under a stack of papers, but her friend's sharp eyes missed nothing. Margie had always been able to see right through her attempts at deflection, ever since they were kids.
Inventory, huh? Is that why you look like you haven't slept in a week?
Margie perched on the edge of the desk, pushing a mug of hot chocolate into Clara's hands. Steam rose from the cup, carrying the rich aroma of chocolate and something that smelled distinctly like Margie's secret spice blend.
Come on, spill. How bad is it?
It's just a temporary setback.
Clara wrapped her hands around the warm mug, avoiding Margie's concerned gaze. The ceramic burned against her cold fingers, but she welcomed the sensation.
Next season's crop will be better. I've already started implementing new frost prevention measures, and
Clara,
Margie's tone was gentle but firm.
you can't keep doing this alone.
watch me.
Clara stood abruptly, moving to the kitchen where her grandmother's Christmas cactus sat in its usual spot by the window. Its vibrant red blooms were the only splash of color in the room, a stubborn reminder of better days. She grabbed the watering can, probably overdoing it in her attempt to stay busy.
Besides, the Christmas market will help. I've got those handmade wreaths ready to go, and
Speaking of the market,
Margie interrupted, following her into the kitchen, her boots clicking against the worn linoleum floor.
you are coming tonight, right? The whole town's going to be there. It'll be good for business.
Clara focused on the cactus blooms, remembering how her grandmother would always say they were right on time for Christmas, like nature's own decoration. The memory brought an ache to her chest that had nothing to do with financial troubles.
I've got too much work here. The irrigation system needs checking before it freezes again, and
Margie's sudden gasp cut her off. Clara turned to find her friend holding up a stack of past due notices she'd discovered under the pile of cheerful Christmas cards on the counter.
Clara, these are from months ago. Why didn't you say anything?
because it's my problem to solve.
The words came out sharper than intended. Clara softened her tone at Margie's hurt expression, guilt twisting in her stomach.
Look, I appreciate your concern, but Graham trusted me with this farm. She believed in me. I can't let her down.
And she'd want you to accept help.
Margie insisted, waving the notices like a frustrated referee with red cards.
Your grandmother was the most practical person I knew. She wouldn't want you killing yourself trying to save this place alone. Remember how she used to rope in half the town for harvest season?
Clara moved to the window, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered fields in warm hues of pink and orange. Her breath fogged the glass as her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. This farm isn't just about trees, Clara Bear. It's the heart of Christmas in Snowfall Ridge. It's about family, community, bringing joy to people's homes. The words brought both comfort and an overwhelming sense of responsibility that threatened to crush her. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle tick of her grandmother's ancient wall clock, until Margie spoke again, softer this time.
Just come to the market. 2 hours tops. You can check the irrigation system first. I'll even throw in free hot chocolate from my booth.
Clara's shoulders slumped in defeat, knowing she was fighting a losing battle against both Margie's persistence and her own financial reality.
Fine. But I need to finish my evening rounds first.
Deal.
Margie's triumph was obvious, her smile bright enough to rival the Christmas lights strung across the porch.
I'll wait here and make sure you actually change clothes. No showing up in those work boots.
In the barn, searching for her market display supplies among the organized chaos of farming equipment, Clara's hands found an old cardboard box labeled Christmas Magic in her grandmother's flowing script. Inside, tissue paper wrapped countless ornaments collected over the years, each one holding a precious memory. She lifted out a delicate glass snowflake, and suddenly she was 17 again, laughing as Alex Gray helped her hang decorations, his gray eyes twinkling as he held her steady on the ladder, his warm breath tickling her neck as he teased her about her fear of heights.
Clara.
Margie's voice snapped her back to reality, echoing through the barn.
You okay in there?
Coming.
Clara carefully wrapped the snowflake, pushing away memories of warm hands and winter kisses that belonged to a different girl in a different time. She had more important things to worry about than old heartbreaks and what-ifs. 20 minutes later, freshly changed into her best jeans and a sweater that didn't smell like pine sap, and trying to ignore Margie's satisfied smirk, Clara paused at the farmhouse door. The peeling paint caught her eye, another item on her endless to-do list. The sagging gutters would need attention before the next snow, and was that a new crack in the bottom porch step? Every glance revealed another repair she couldn't afford, another piece of her grandmother's legacy she was failing to preserve. But Margie was right about one thing: she couldn't hide away forever, pretending the mounting bills would somehow solve themselves. The farm needed income, and the Christmas market was an opportunity she couldn't ignore, no matter how much she wanted to stay in her safe bubble of denial.
Ready?
Margie asked, dangling her car keys with an encouraging smile that said she understood more than she let on. Clara squared her shoulders, pulling on her warmest knit hat.
As I'll ever be.
Chapter 3: Frosty Reunion. Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the last wreath on her makeshift display. The market square buzzed with holiday cheer that felt oddly disconnected from her mounting anxiety. Strings of white lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a warm glow that softened the gathering darkness, while the scent of Margie's famous gingerbread cookies mingled with wood smoke from the central fire pit.
Perfect,
Margie declared, appearing at Clara's elbow with 2 steaming cups.
though you might want to raise your prices. These are artisan pieces, not bargain bin decorations.
They're priced exactly right for our customers,
Clara muttered, accepting the hot chocolate gratefully. The warmth seeped through her worn gloves, a small comfort against the December chill. She deliberately positioned her booth facing away from the main entrance, telling herself it was to catch the best lighting. In reality, she couldn't shake the nervous energy that had plagued her since overhearing whispers at the general store yesterday. Her fingers drummed unconsciously against the ceramic mug.
Oh my God!
Margie's cup froze halfway to her lips.
Is that?
Clara's stomach dropped before she even turned around. She knew that tone, had been dreading it since she'd heard the rumors of his return. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight of Alex Gray in the flesh, looking like he'd stepped straight out of a luxury magazine advertisement. The years had been unfairly kind to him, she thought bitterly. Her hands betrayed her, suspending a wreath mid-adjustment as their eyes met across the crowded square. Even at this distance, those gray eyes hit her like a physical force. He'd grown into his features, she noticed distantly, the boyish charm replaced by sharp angles and careful polish. His cashmere coat probably cost more than her monthly mortgage payment. The same coat she'd seen splashed across business magazines, though it looked different here against the backdrop of twinkling lights and familiar storefronts.
Clara.
Margie's voice seemed to come from very far away.
Breathe, honey.
But breathing became significantly more difficult as Alex changed course, his confident stride carrying him directly toward her booth. Clara busied herself with straightening items that were already perfectly arranged, her movements becoming more frantic with each approaching footstep. The pine needles pricked her fingers through her thin gloves, grounding her in reality.
Hello, Clara.
His voice was deeper than she remembered, or maybe that was just the weight of 10 years pressing down on each syllable. She forced herself to look up, to meet his gaze with what she hoped was professional detachment, though her heart hammered traitorously in her chest.
Alex.
Her voice came out steadier than she felt.
Welcome back to Snowfall Ridge.
The silence stretched between them like frost spreading across a window pane. From the corner of her eye, Clara could see Margie pretending to rearrange her cookie display while obviously eavesdropping. The scent of gingerbread wafted over, absurdly domestic against the tension crackling in the air.
How long are you in town?
The question escaped before she could stop it, even as she mentally kicked herself for showing any interest.
Just until the media circus dies down.
His smile didn't reach his eyes.
Though I'd forgotten how beautiful it is here during Christmas.
Clara's fingers tightened around the wreath she was still holding, the rough texture of pine boughs digging into her palms.
Yes, well, some things don't change.
This is gorgeous work.
Alex reached for one of her wreaths, the expensive leather of his gloves a stark contrast to the natural pine and berries.
How much?
It's not for sale.
The words came out sharp enough to draw Margie's head up in surprise. Clara could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, but she held her ground. Alex's eyebrows rose slightly.
None of them are for sale.
That one's spoken for.
Clara lied, knowing she was being unreasonable but unable to stop herself. The thought of her handiwork hanging in whatever sleek penthouse he called home made her skin crawl. She couldn't bear the idea of her careful craftsmanship becoming just another trophy in his collection.
Clara dear.
Mrs. Jenkins' cheerful voice cut through the tension like a warm knife through butter. The innkeeper bustled up to Alex, beaming.
Alex Gray, as I live and breathe. We've missed you around here. Though I imagine Silicon Valley's a bit more exciting than our little town.
Clara watched in horror as Mrs. Jenkins patted Alex's arm conspiratorially, her weathered hands lingering on his expensive wool coat.
You should see what Clara's done with the farm. Working herself to the bone to keep it going, bless her heart. Such a shame about the harvest this year, and with the bank being so strict about payments. And those repairs to the greenhouse certainly didn't help matters.
Mrs. Jenkins.
Clara cut in, her cheeks burning with mortification as the innkeeper aired her private struggles like weekly gossip.
I believe Mr. Thompson was looking for you earlier. Something about the inn's holiday booking?
The older woman's eyes widened behind her wire-rimmed glasses.
Oh. Yes, of course. Alex, you must stop by the inn while you're here. We've updated the lobby since you left. The new fireplace is absolutely stunning.
Clara turned away, pretending to help a young couple examining her hand-painted glass ornaments. Her hands shook as she wrapped their purchases in tissue paper, painfully aware of Alex's presence still hovering nearby like a persistent shadow from her past. The scent of his cologne, something expensive and woodsy, drifted over periodically, making her stomach clench. When she finally looked up again, he had moved to the hot chocolate stand, but his eyes kept finding their way back to her booth, gray and calculating in the twilight. The evening wore on in a blur of forced smiles and small talk, her throat growing raw from repeating the same cheerful descriptions of her wreaths and ornaments. Clara watched Alex working the crowd like the CEO he'd become, charm flowing as easily as Margie's hot chocolate. The sight of him moving through the market square with such practiced ease made her chest ache with memories of a younger, less polished Alex. But it was his conversation with Mr. Thompson that made her blood run cold. The bank manager's aggressive gesturing and Alex's thoughtful nod told her exactly what they were discussing, her mounting debt and the farm's precarious future. She abandoned her booth, crossing the square in quick strides, her boots crunching against the fresh snow.
Alex.
He turned, surprise flickering across his features. Mr. Thompson had the grace to look embarrassed, stuffing his hands into his pockets and suddenly finding great interest in his shoes.
My farm is none of your business, Alex,
she said, her voice low and controlled despite the tremor threatening to break through.
You made that clear when you left. When you chose Silicon Valley over everything else.
The market wound down around them, vendors packing up their wares as the fairy lights twinkled overhead like silent witnesses to their confrontation. Clara methodically wrapped each unsold wreath, deliberately keeping her eyes down as she loaded them into her truck's bed, the fresh pine needles pricking her fingers through her worn gloves. She could feel Alex watching her, could practically hear the wheels turning in that brilliant business mind of his. But she didn't look up. Couldn't look up. Because if she did, she might see pity in those gray eyes. And that was the one thing Clara Evans couldn't bear, not from the boy who'd once promised her the world, only to chase his own instead. Chapter 4: Snowstorm Strikes. Alex's hands tightened around the heated steering wheel as his Aston Martin carved through the treacherous road. The GPS had failed 20 minutes ago, leaving him to navigate the back roads of Snowfall Ridge by memory alone, a memory that felt as clouded as the whiteout conditions surrounding him. He should have known better than to trust the sleek navigation system this far from civilization. The irony wasn't lost on him, a man whose empire was built on connectivity now completely cut off from the digital world. His mother had warned him about keeping his old Land Rover, the one actually built for Vermont winters. But he traded practicality for image years ago, hadn't he? Just like he traded everything else that mattered.
Come on.
He muttered, fighting the wheel as the car fishtailed again. The expensive performance tires, perfect for Silicon Valley's manicured highways, proved worthless against rural Vermont's winter fury. His mind flashed to the winter tires his father had always insisted on, advice he'd arrogantly dismissed as small-town thinking. A sudden gust rocked the vehicle, and before he could correct, the Aston Martin drifted into a snowbank with a soft crunch. Perfect. Just perfect. The engine whined uselessly as he tried to reverse, the traction control light flashing mockingly on his dashboard. Alex slumped back in his heated leather seat, watching snow accumulate on the windshield with alarming speed. Through the swirling white, a familiar warm glow caught his eye: Clara's farmhouse. Of all the places to get stranded, the universe, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. He checked his phone. No signal. Obviously. The same phone that could summon a private jet with a single tap was now nothing more than an expensive paperweight.
You've got to be kidding me.
The irony wasn't lost on him, a tech billionaire rendered helpless by good old-fashioned winter weather. At least he had his coat, even if the Italian wool wasn't exactly designed for trudging through snowdrifts. The same coat that had earned admiring glances in San Francisco now felt absurdly inadequate. The wind hit him like a physical blow as he stepped out, nearly yanking the car door from his grip. Snow immediately worked its way into his dress shoes, and he silently cursed his stubborn insistence on maintaining his usual polished image. The farmhouse lights beckoned through the darkness, maybe a quarter-mile away. Close enough to reach, far enough to be thoroughly miserable getting there. He could almost hear Clara's voice in his head, teasing him about his city slicker ways. Each step was a battle against deepening snow and howling wind. His shoes were blocks of ice, his pants soaked to the knee, the pristine wool now collecting chunks of snow and ice. By the time he reached the wraparound porch, Alex could barely feel his feet. He hesitated at the door, pride warring with necessity. The storm made the decision for him, driving another icy blast down his collar like a reminder of his foolishness. His knock echoed hollow against the old wood. For a moment, only the wind answered. Then footsteps approached and the porch light flickered on, casting warm yellow light across the weathered boards. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, wearing flannel pajama pants and an oversized sweater, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Her expression shifted from concern to recognition to something harder to read. She looked exactly as he remembered, yet somehow more beautiful, or maybe that was just the hypothermia talking.
What are you doing here?
She asked, her voice barely audible over the wind.
Car went off the road.
Alex gestured vaguely behind him, trying to keep his teeth from chattering.
I don't suppose I could.
Come in.
She cut him off, stepping back.
Before you let all the heat out.
Her tone was clipped, practical, the voice she'd always used when he was being particularly thick-headed. The mudroom felt blessedly warm after the storm. Alex bent to remove his ruined shoes, acutely aware of Clara watching him with crossed arms. His fingers were too numb to manage the laces, fumbling uselessly with the wet leather.
Those aren't exactly winter-appropriate,
she observed dryly.
They're Italian.
The words sounded ridiculous, even to his own ears.
They're useless.
Clara disappeared into a closet, returning with a pair of worn work boots.
These were Grandpa's. They should fit well enough.
The boots probably cost less than his socks, but right now they looked like salvation. Alex accepted them without comment, noting how carefully she avoided any contact as she handed them over. The boots were well broken in leather, sturdy and practical, everything his designer shoes weren't. Just like Clara herself, he thought, compared to the artificial world he'd chosen to inhabit. A flicker of the overhead light drew both their attention. Clara's mouth tightened, a familiar expression that Alex remembered all too well from their shared past.
Stay here,
she ordered, already moving toward the kitchen with purposeful strides.
Let me get some supplies together before.
The lights flickered again, more insistently this time. Alex followed her despite the command, his designer shoes clicking against the worn floorboards as he nearly collided with her when she yanked open a cabinet.
I can help,
he offered, reaching for a stack of neatly folded blankets, fighting the urge to inhale their familiar pine and lavender scent.
I've got it.
Clara shouldered past him, gathering candles and matches with practiced efficiency.
I know where everything is.
Clara.
The tea kettle's still hot if you want something to warm up.
She interrupted, clearly preferring to pretend he wasn't there, her movements sharp and deliberate.
Mugs are in the cabinet by the sink.
Alex found the cabinet easily enough. The kitchen's layout hadn't changed since he'd spent countless afternoons here in high school, doing homework at the very same table while Clara's grandmother baked cookies. His hand hesitated over a familiar set of ceramic mugs pushed to the back, dusty with disuse. He'd given them to Clara for her 18th birthday, hand-painted with winter scenes that had made her eyes light up, back when forever had seemed possible and Silicon Valley was just a distant dream. Instead, he selected 2 plain mugs from the front, trying to ignore the pang in his chest. The ledger lay open on the kitchen table, columns of numbers illuminated by the dying light. Even upside down, Alex could see the concerning pattern of red ink, his business acumen immediately registering the precarious financial situation it revealed. Clara appeared suddenly, snapping the book closed with more force than necessary, her knuckles white against the worn leather cover.
That's private,
she said sharply, a flush creeping up her neck. Their eyes met across the table. In that brief moment, Alex saw past her defensive anger to the worry beneath, the same look she'd worn when her grandmother first fell ill. Then she turned away, busying herself with tea bags, her shoulders tense beneath her worn sweater. The lights gave one final valiant effort before plunging the kitchen into darkness. Alex reached instinctively for where he'd seen a flashlight, his hand colliding with Clara's in the dark. Her skin was warm against his still cold fingers, soft, despite the calluses earned from years of farm work. For a heartbeat neither moved, and Alex found himself holding his breath. Clara jerked back first, as if burned.
I need to check the nursery,
she announced, voice slightly uneven.
The seedlings will die if the heating system fails.
I'll come with you.
Alex grabbed the flashlight before she could protest, his tone brooking no argument.
You'll need light.
The walk to the greenhouse was silent except for their boots crunching through fresh snow, his borrowed ones significantly more practical than his Italian leather shoes. The beam of the flashlight caught ice crystals in the air, creating halos of light that reminded Alex of the science projects they'd done together in this very greenhouse. Back then, Clara had known every plant by name, treating each seedling like a precious child. That same careful attention showed in her movements now as she checked temperature gauges and adjusted heating elements, though the set of her shoulders spoke of years of worry he hadn't been there to share. Alex kept the beam steady, trying not to notice how the flashlight's glow caught the auburn highlights in her hair, or how gracefully she still moved between the rows of tiny trees. The familiar scent of pine and soil brought back memories of helping her grandmother pot saplings, Clara's laugh echoing through the greenhouse as he managed to get more dirt on himself than in the pots. He'd complained about the mess then, but now he'd give anything to go back to those simpler times. What would her grandmother say if she could see them now, trapped together in a storm of both snow and unresolved feelings?
The backup generator's working,
Clara reported tersely, closing the control panel with a definitive click.
The seedlings should be fine.
Back in the farmhouse, Clara immediately claimed the armchair furthest from the fireplace, wrapping herself in a familiar patchwork quilt. Alex recognized it as her grandmother's work. He'd watched the old woman piecing it together during many winter evenings, her gentle voice sharing stories of the town's history as her needle flew through the fabric.
Clara.
He began carefully, settling onto the couch and trying to ignore how the familiar leather seemed to embrace him like an old friend.
About what happened?
A tremendous crash from outside made them both jump. Clara was on her feet in an instant, the quilt falling to the floor in a cascade of colors. Alex moved without thinking, reaching for her arm, an old protective instinct he'd never quite managed to shake. She flinched away from his touch as if it burned.
It's just a branch,
she said, more to herself than him, her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't quite hide.
The guest room is upstairs, first door on the right. There are extra blankets in the closet.
The dismissal was clear as mountain air. Alex watched her retrieve the quilt and disappear up the back stairs, leaving him alone with the crackling fire and the howling storm, feeling every one of the miles and years that had grown between them. He found himself too restless for sleep, despite the late hour and the emotional toll of the day. The couch proved more inviting than the guest room, offering both warmth from the dying fire and the comforting familiarity of this room where he'd spent so many evenings in his youth, dreaming of future success while stealing glances at Clara. He draped his jacket over a nearby chair, loosened his tie with fingers that felt clumsy with exhaustion, and stretched out on the worn cushions that still somehow remembered his shape. The last thing he saw before drifting off was a framed photo on the mantel, two teenagers in front of a Christmas tree, snow in their hair and laughter in their eyes, his arm draped casually around Clara's shoulders. A moment captured in time, before ambition and fear and foolish choices had driven them apart, before board meetings and profit margins had replaced cookie baking and tree trimming in his world. As sleep claimed him, Alex wondered if some things once broken could ever truly be fixed. Chapter 5: The Billionaire's Bargain. Alex jerked awake to his phone buzzing incessantly against his chest. Sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows, and his neck protested from sleeping on the couch. A familiar scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, momentarily disorienting him as memories of childhood winters flooded back. Squinting at his screen, he found 37 missed calls and a barrage of texts from his PR team, each message more urgent than the last. Sir, photos of you entering Evan's farm during Snowstorm trending. TMZ running story about secret romance. Stock dropping, board wants statement.
Damn it.
He scrambled to his feet, his wrinkled suit a lost cause. His Italian leather shoes, worth more than most people's monthly salary, were scuffed from last night's trek through the snow. Through the window he caught movement, Clara marching across the snow-covered yard, her posture rigid with anger. Her auburn hair caught the morning light, reminding him painfully of easier times. Two men with cameras ducked behind trees, their lenses trained on her every move like predators stalking prey. Alex grabbed his coat and rushed outside, cutting across to the barn where Clara had disappeared. The crisp morning air bit at his face, snow crunching beneath his feet. He found her violently sorting through boxes of Christmas ornaments, practically throwing the delicate glass balls into separate containers. The sight of her handling her grandmother's cherished decorations so roughly told him exactly how upset she was.
Those vultures are hiding behind my grandmother's blue spruces.
She spat without looking up.
Asked if I was your latest scandal. As if I don't have actual work to do. Like keeping this place running isn't a full-time job already.
Clara, I'm so.
Don't you dare apologize.
She slammed down a box of silver bells, the metallic clash echoing through the barn's wooden beams.
This isn't your fault. But I need them gone. Now.
They both turned at the sound of engines. Through the barn's frosted window, they watched 3 news vans pull up to the farm's entrance, reporters already setting up tripods aimed at the house. Alex recognized the logos, all major networks. This was about to get much worse.
This is insane,
Clara whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped the windowsill.
My grandmother's farm isn't some circus show for entertainment. She'd be heartbroken to see it like this.
Alex paced the length of the barn, his mind racing through scenarios and solutions, his expensive shoes leaving wet tracks on the wooden floor. The media wouldn't leave without a story, he knew their persistence all too well. His company couldn't afford another scandal, not after the disaster with Victoria. And Clara? Clara needed financial stability more than she'd admit. He'd seen the past due notices in the office when he'd sought shelter from the storm. He stopped abruptly, an idea taking shape. It was risky, potentially disastrous, but it might solve everyone's problems in one fell swoop. The kind of crazy scheme that had gotten them both in trouble as teenagers, but had usually worked out in the end.
Oh no,
Clara said, recognition flooding her features.
I know that face. That's your, let's steal the principal's car and park it on the football field face.
That was one time.
Alex turned to her, choosing his words carefully, aware that his next sentence could either save them both or ruin what little trust remained between them.
What if we gave them exactly what they want?
What do you mean?
A story. A reconciliation. 2 childhood sweethearts reuniting at Christmas. Think about it. The media gets their heartwarming holiday piece and leaves town. My company's stock stabilizes because I'm no longer the jilted CEO hiding from scandal. And you?
He hesitated, knowing he was about to step onto dangerous ground.
The publicity could save the farm.
Absolutely not.
Clara threw her hands up, sending an ornament rolling across the floor.
I'm not pretending to be your fiancé just to fix your PR problem.
It would only be until Christmas.
Alex pressed, fighting the urge to close the distance between them.
3 weeks. We set clear boundaries, control the narrative ourselves instead of letting them make up stories. And I'll ensure the farm gets enough business to stay afloat through next season.
Clara stalked over to her office nook, pulling out the worn leather ledger. Alex watched her flip through pages of numbers, each one worse than the last. He kept quiet, remembering how much she hated being pushed into decisions. The familiar crease between her brows deepened with each turn of the page, a gesture he'd memorized years ago when they studied together in high school. Finally, she looked up, defeat warring with determination in her eyes.
We need terms. Written down.
Alex grabbed a blank tree order form and a pen, his fingers brushing against the farm's letterhead, that brought back memories of summer jobs and stolen kisses between deliveries. Clara dictated conditions rapid fire.
No public displays of affection beyond hand-holding. Separate living arrangements. You stay at your mother's house. The engagement ends Christmas Day, no exceptions.
As Alex wrote, carefully transcribing each rule in his precise handwriting, he reached into his coat pocket, fingers closing around the small velvet box he'd been carrying since his return to Snowfall Ridge. He told himself it was just nostalgia that made him take his grandmother's ring from the safety deposit box before leaving the city, but deep down, he knew there was more to it than that.
We'll need this to be convincing,
he said softly, opening the box. The vintage diamond caught the morning light, sending sparkles dancing across the barn walls. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "Save this for someone special, Alex. Someone who makes your heart feel like home." Clara's breath hitched. Her hand shook slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger, both of them pretending not to notice how naturally it settled there, like it had been waiting all these years. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. They moved to the farmhouse kitchen, awkwardly working out their story over coffee that Clara had made exactly how he remembered, 1 sugar, splash of cream.
We reconnected during the storm.
Alex suggested, choosing his words carefully.
I realized I never stopped loving you.
Too dramatic.
Clara interrupted, twisting the ring.
Keep it simple. You came to buy a Christmas tree, we talked, old feelings resurfaced.
The kitchen door burst open, making them both jump. Margie stood there, cheeks flushed from running, her Christmas sweater slightly askew.
Clara Evans, why are there news vans outside your...
She froze, eyes locked on Clara's left hand.
Is that...
Alex instinctively reached for Clara's hand, squeezing it gently, hoping she couldn't feel his pulse racing.
We wanted you to be the first to know,
he said smoothly while Clara managed a weak smile. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Margie's eyes narrowed, darting between them. Her skeptical expression made it clear their performance needed work. Alex fought the urge to pull Clara closer, to make it more convincing.
No interviews without both of us present.
Clara added to their growing list of rules, while Alex made calls to his PR team, his voice falling into the familiar cadence of business negotiations.
Minimal social media. And absolutely no one finds out about the farm's financial situation.
Finally, Alex stood on the porch, watching more reporters gathering at the farm's entrance like vultures circling their prey. Clara twisted the ring anxiously beside him, her shoulder barely brushing his arm. The contact sent electricity through his skin, even through layers of winter clothing.
Just until Christmas.
He reminded her softly, wishing the words didn't feel like a lie.
Just until Christmas,
she echoed, but neither of them could quite meet the other's eyes as they sealed their deal with a handshake, both acutely aware of how many ways this charade could go wrong. Chapter 6, A Fake Fiancé's Festivities. Clara stared at her reflection in the bakery's window, adjusting her hand-knitted scarf for the 10th time, the soft wool catching on her mittens. Through the frosted glass, She could see Margie arranging fresh-baked cookies in the display case, her best friend's knowing smile suggesting she was probably plotting ways to meddle in this whole fake engagement situation. The aroma of gingerbread and vanilla wafted through the seams of the old wooden door, making Clara's stomach twist with both hunger and anxiety.
Ready.
Alex's voice startled her. He stood too close, radiating that expensive cologne that definitely hadn't been part of his signature scent back in high school. The scent reminded her of glossy magazines and city skylines, everything he'd chosen over Snowfall Ridge.
As I'll ever be.
Clara pushed open the door, triggering the cheerful jingle of bells that had welcomed her nearly every morning for the past decade. The warmth of the bakery enveloped her immediately, along with memories of countless conversations shared over steaming mugs.
Well, if it isn't the happy couple.
Margie's sing-song voice carried across the bakery, drawing the attention of several regular customers who pretended not to eavesdrop.
The usual for you, Clara. And Alex, what's your fiancé's go-to order?
Clara felt Alex stiffen beside her, his designer coat brushing against her worn winter jacket. A test. Of course Margie would pull something like this. Her friend's blue eyes sparkled with mischief.
She'll have
Alex cleared his throat, shifting his weight.
coffee. Black.
The look Margie shot Clara could have melted the snow outside.
Wow. Just wow.
The words dripped with theatrical disappointment.
Peppermint hot chocolate.
Clara jumped in, cheeks burning hotter than the bakery's ovens.
Extra whipped cream.
And chocolate shavings,
Margie added pointedly, crossing her arms.
which your beloved would totally know if.
If I hadn't been traveling so much.
Alex smoothly interrupted, his businessman's charm on full display.
I'm looking forward to learning all Clara's favorites again.
His arm slipped around Clara's waist, warm and secure, and she fought the urge to jump away, her body remembering far too well how perfectly they used to fit together. The morning dissolved into a blur of similar moments, holding hands while window shopping past Mr. Peterson's hardware store and Mrs. Mitchell's craft boutique, sharing knowing smiles with passers-by, maintaining what Clara mentally dubbed their engagement bubble of personal space. By the time they reached the town square for the tree decorating contest, her face hurt from fake smiling, and her heart ached from pretending. By the time they reached the town square for the tree decorating contest, her face hurt from fake smiling, and her heart ached from pretending.
Here.
Clara handed Alex a glittering snowflake ornament without thinking, the crystal catching the winter sunlight.
This goes up high, then the silver bells below, and
She froze, realizing she'd fallen into their old pattern from decorating the school's Christmas tree senior year, when they'd had their whole future stretched out before them, full of promise and shared dreams. Alex held the snowflake delicately, something unreadable crossing his face, his gray eyes softening in a way that made her pulse skip.
You still remember?
muscle memory.
Clara stepped back, busying herself with entangling a strand of lights, trying to ignore how her fingers trembled slightly at the familiar motion. A camera flash made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. Some reporter had managed to sneak close to their station, notepad already out, pen poised like a weapon.
Mr. Gray, how does it feel returning to your hometown roots? And Ms. Evans, can you tell us about the proposal?
Before Clara could stammer out their rehearsed story, Alex's arm wrapped around her shoulders, solid and warm against the December chill.
Sorry.
He whispered, his breath warm against her ear, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Then his lips pressed against her cheek, lingering just long enough for another camera flash, and she caught the faintest hint of his cologne, the same one he'd worn in high school. Clara's smile felt wooden, her cheeks aching with the effort.
So romantic.
She managed, grateful when the reporter moved on to harass other contestants, leaving behind the scent of coffee and desperation. The cookie bake-off that afternoon proved a welcome distraction, if only because watching Alex completely butcher their gingerbread men was genuinely entertaining. Flour dusted his expensive sweater, and she had to bite back a smile at how out of place he looked in the homey kitchen. He'd somehow managed to give one cookie 6 legs and another what appeared to be a unicorn horn, his normally precise hands completely lost when it came to simple baking.
That's meant to be a hat.
He protested when she dissolved into giggles, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her that she thought had long since frozen over.
A hat?
Clara held up the misshapen cookie, trying to see it from different angles.
Alex, it looks like it's being attacked by a very small tree.
Better than yours.
He pointed at her slightly lopsided attempt, a playful gleam in his gray eyes that made her heart stutter.
That one's clearly having an existential crisis.
It's contemplative.
She defended, catching herself before she could fall back into their old pattern of playful banter. Their laughter drew Mrs. Jenkins like a moth to flame. The innkeeper cornered them by the cooling racks, practically vibrating with curiosity, her holiday sweater jingling with tiny bells.
Now, dears, you simply must tell me how he proposed. Was it romantic? Did he get down on one knee?
Well,
Clara looked at Alex in panic, her mind suddenly blank of their carefully constructed story.
I took her to.
Alex began.
he surprised me at.
Clara said simultaneously. They stared at each other. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes narrowed, reminding Clara uncomfortably of a hawk spotting its prey.
The farm.
Alex recovered smoothly.
I surprised her at the farm, but then.
A tray of cookies clattered to the floor, cutting off his words. Clara jumped at the noise, her nerves already frayed.
Oh no.
Alex said unconvincingly.
How clumsy of me. Let me clean that up.
Clara escaped to the relative safety of the farm after that, but Alex followed, insisting he needed to learn the business for appearance's sake. The excuse sounded hollow even to her ears. Which was how she found herself standing behind him at the wrapping station, guiding his hands as they wrestled with the netting for a particularly robust Fraser fur, trying to ignore how his shoulders felt beneath her palms.
You have to pull it tight,
She instructed, trying to ignore how perfectly she fit against his back, how natural it felt to move together like this.
otherwise it.
Alex's phone buzzed. He stepped away to answer it, leaving her suddenly cold, and Clara pretended not to notice how his expression darkened at Victor's name on the screen, or how her stomach clenched at the reminder of his real life waiting beyond their small town bubble. The carol sing-along that evening nearly broke her. Clara had successfully avoided it for years, but Margie, the traitor, started playing their old duet the moment they walked into the community center. The opening notes of Baby It's Cold Outside filled the room like ghosts from her past, and suddenly everyone was watching expectantly, the weight of their gazes almost physical. Clara shook her head firmly, but Alex was already being pushed toward the makeshift stage. Their eyes met, and she saw the same mix of resignation and nostalgia she felt, like looking in a mirror of their shared history. The muscle memory kicked in again as they moved through the familiar choreography, her body remembering every turn and playful chase even as her mind screamed to stop, to protect what little was left of her heart. Later, helping Alex carry boxes of decorations into the farmhouse storage room, Clara's heart stopped when he paused by an old shoebox. She knew exactly what was inside, every Christmas card he'd sent that first year at college, before the calls got shorter and the messages stopped coming. She'd kept them all, unable to throw away those pieces of their shared past, each one filled with promises that had eventually scattered like autumn leaves. Alex's hand hovered over the lid, but he moved on without comment. Clara released the breath she'd been holding, her fingers trembling slightly on the cardboard box she carried. The town council's holiday party brought fresh challenges. Dancing with Alex felt like stepping back in time, especially when his hand found that spot on her back, the exact place it had always rested during slow dances at prom, homecoming, every school event where they'd been inseparable. The familiar weight of his palm sent shivers down her spine that she desperately tried to ignore. Clara forced herself to count ceiling tiles until the song ended, fighting the urge to lean into his warmth like she once had. The mistletoe incident at Snowfall Inn was pure torture. They'd stopped for hot chocolate, Alex finally remembering her order correctly, extra whipped cream, dash of cinnamon, only to find themselves trapped under a sprig of the cursed plant. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath as they stood frozen, years of history hanging between them. Mrs. Jenkins, the innkeeper, wasn't even trying to hide her eager smile. Clara finally pecked his cheek quickly, ignoring the disappointed sighs from their audience and the lingering scent of his cologne that brought back too many memories. That evening, seeking peace, Clara retreated to the farmhouse porch with her popcorn garland supplies, the old wooden boards creaking beneath her rocking chair. Alex found her there, wordlessly picking up a needle and thread, his fingers working with surprising dexterity for someone who now spent his days in corporate boardrooms.
Remember when we made these for the winter formal?
He asked softly.
You kept eating more popcorn than you strung.
You were the one who started the popcorn fight,
Clara corrected, the memory rising unbidden.
Mrs. Peterson found kernels in the gym for weeks. She blamed the freshman class and never knew it was her star student's fault.
The conversation flowed easier than it had in days, memories spilling out, until Clara caught herself smiling genuinely at Alex's impression of their old chemistry teacher, complete with the signature nose wiggle and chalk-dusted hands. She cleared her throat, forcing herself back to the present.
We should discuss the charity gala schedule.
Alex's phone buzzed again, Victor's nightly check-in, right on time like a clock striking midnight in a fairy tale. The comfortable silence shattered as Alex stepped away to take the call, leaving Clara alone with her cooling cider and the dangerous warmth of remembering. She watched his silhouette through the window, noting how his shoulders tensed as he spoke with his business partner, and wondered if he felt as torn between two worlds as she did in that moment. Chapter 7: Rekindling Sparks. Clara's boots crunched through fresh snow as she made her way to the barn at dawn, coffee thermos clutched in her mittened hands. The sound of metal clanking against metal drew her attention, and she pushed open the heavy wooden door to find Alex Gray, billionaire tech mogul, and her pretend fiancé, flat on his back under her grandmother's ancient John Deere tractor. The early morning light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the barn's worn floorboards. The sight stopped her in her tracks. Gone was the perfectly pressed suit and carefully styled hair. Instead, he wore worn jeans and a flannel workshirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms streaked with grease. Her breath caught as memories of teenage Alex tinkering with his first car in this very barn flooded back. She could almost hear the echoes of their younger selves laughing, the radio playing old country songs while they worked.
The timing belt's shot,
He called out without emerging.
and the fuel line's more patch than pipe at this point. We'll need to order parts from Henderson's.
How did you even know to check the tractor?
Clara set the thermos down on her grandmother's old workbench, trying to mask her surprise. The familiar scent of motor oil and hay stirred more memories she'd rather keep buried. Alex slid out from under the machine, a smudge of grease across his forehead.
You mentioned yesterday it wasn't starting right. Figured I'd take a look before the day got going.
He reached for a rag to wipe his hands.
Remember how your grandmother used to say, a farm's only as good as its equipment? She'd have my hide if I let this old girl fall apart.
The casual reference to Gran knocked the wind from Clara's lungs. She busied herself pouring coffee into the thermos cap, hoping Alex wouldn't notice her reaction. Her hands trembled slightly as steam rose from the dark liquid.
We should check the saplings before it gets too late.
The morning air bit at their cheeks as they walked the rows of young trees. Fresh snow crunched beneath their boots, and their breath formed little clouds in the frigid air. Alex moved with surprising confidence, gently lifting branches to examine the needles.
These Douglas firs are coming along nicely.
He observed.
The blue-green color means they're healthy, getting enough nutrients. Though that section over there might need additional fertilizer come spring.
Clara stared at him, warmth blooming in her chest despite herself.
You remember Gran's lessons about tree care?
Every word.
Alex's eyes remained on the sapling, but his voice softened.
She was a better teacher than half my college professors. Used to say you had to feel the tree's personality to know what it needed.
They fell into an efficient rhythm, clearing snow from the vulnerable seedlings. Clara couldn't help noticing Alex's new boots, proper work boots from Peterson's general store, not the Italian leather ones he'd worn his first day back. He'd clearly been paying attention to more than just business calls. The sight stirred something dangerous in her heart. By mid-morning, they'd retreated to the barn to warm up. Clara was reorganizing tools when Alex's quiet "oh" drew her attention. He stood by the central support beam, fingers tracing weathered wood where two sets of initials were carved inside a crooked heart. CE plus AG. The summer air had been thick with fireflies when they'd carved those letters, full of teenage dreams and promises neither of them had kept. Clara's cheeks burned. She attacked a stack of empty planters with unnecessary vigor, the plastic clattering loudly in the quiet barn. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to ignore the weight of unspoken words hanging between them.
Your accounting system needs an upgrade.
Alex said suddenly, mercifully changing the subject.
I could show you this program I designed. It might help streamline things. Save you some late nights with the books.
Which was how Clara found herself perched on a hay bale, laptop balanced on her knees, with Alex's shoulder pressed against hers as he walked her through the software. His cologne, something expensive and subtle, mixed with the scent of pine needles and motor oil. Clara forced herself to focus on the screen, not the warmth of him beside her, or how his fingers brushed hers when he pointed out features. The ease of working together again scared her more than any spreadsheet could. They ate lunch in the greenhouse, surrounded by rows of tiny trees destined to become Christmas centerpieces. Alex sat on an overturned bucket, looking oddly at home despite his obvious wealth. His cashmere sweater seemed strangely at peace among the earthy scents and rustic setting, as if some part of him had been waiting to return to this simplicity.
Sometimes I miss this.
He admitted, gesturing to their surroundings.
The smell of pine, the quiet. My office in the city.
He trailed off, his gaze landing on her face instead of the trees, with an intensity that made her pulse quicken traitorously. Clara pretended to be very interested in her sandwich, picking at the crust as if it held the secrets to maintaining her composure. The small TV in the greenhouse corner suddenly crackled to life. Margie must have set the timer for the local news again. Alex froze mid-bite as Clara's image filled the screen, standing among rows of Christmas trees. She wore a red plaid coat he didn't recognize, but her knit hat was the same one he'd given her the Christmas before he left for college. Snow dusted her auburn hair where it escaped the hat's confines, and her smile was exactly as he remembered, warm, genuine, and just a little bit crooked. His heart performed the same uncomfortable flip it had done in high school.
The Evans family Christmas tree farm has been a Snowfall Ridge tradition for over 50 years,
she was saying to the reporter.
We're hoping for another great season.
Alex stood abruptly, fumbling for the remote to click off the TV. He pulled his travel flask from his coat pocket, pouring 3 fingers of scotch into his empty coffee mug. The familiar burn couldn't quite drown out the echo of her voice. Moving to the greenhouse windows, he watched Christmas lights beginning to blink to life across town like earthbound stars. The life he'd built in the city felt distant and unreal, like a movie he'd watched rather than lived. The empire he'd created, the wealth he'd amassed, none of it had filled the hollow space that opened in his chest whenever he thought of this place. Of her. Of everything he'd left behind in his rush to become someone else. They retreated to the farmhouse office, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow. Clara buried herself in inventory lists, grateful for the distraction of work, until a splash of color caught her eye. A Polaroid had slipped from between 2 folders, her and Alex at the town tree lighting ceremony their senior year. Her head rested on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them beaming at the camera with the kind of unguarded joy only teenagers could manage. The memory hit her like a physical ache, sharp and sweet. Alex's phone buzzed, shattering the quiet. Victor's name lit up the screen. He silenced it without looking, a muscle ticking in his jaw.
I think I heard something in the storage shed.
He said instead, clearly eager for the distraction.
Should we check it out?
The interruption was almost welcome. They found a family of rabbits had somehow gotten trapped inside, huddled against the winter cold. Clara handled them carefully, remembering how her grandmother had taught her to respect even the smallest creatures on their land. Alex held the door, his movements surprisingly gentle as he helped guide them to safety. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, but he made no move to answer it. The sun was already low when they finally turned to the evening's task, stringing lights on the display trees near the farm entrance. Clara found herself falling into the familiar rhythm, muscle memory taking over as they worked in comfortable silence. The scent of pine and approaching snow filled the air, stirring memories she usually kept carefully locked away.
Gran always said these trees were like beacons of hope,
She found herself saying, her voice soft with remembered warmth.
guiding people home for the holidays.
Alex's hand stilled on the lights.
She told me something similar
He admitted quietly, his voice rougher than usual.
when I visited her after I left.
He focused intently on entangling a strand of lights, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders.
Made me promise to never lose sight of what really matters. I'm not sure I kept that promise very well.
The first snowflakes began to fall as they finished, fat and lazy in the deepening twilight. Without warning, Alex reached out, brushing snow from Clara's hair with familiar tenderness. They both froze, caught in a moment too real for their careful pretense. Clara's skin tingled where his fingers had touched, and she fought the urge to lean into the contact that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. The kitchen offered refuge, warm and bright against the gathering dark. Steam curled up from their hot chocolate mugs, dancing between them like the words neither dared to speak. Alex stared into his cup, as if it held answers to questions he couldn't voice.
I let ambition consume everything.
He finally said, the words barely above a whisper.
Convinced myself success was worth any price.
Clara's fingers found the engagement ring, twisting it around and around. The diamond caught the kitchen light, throwing tiny rainbows across the worn table between them. She couldn't trust herself to respond, afraid her voice would betray the storm of emotions beneath her careful facade. They ended up on the porch swing, watching the last rays of sunset paint their snow-covered world in shades of pink and gold. Though they sat carefully apart, Clara felt the weight of Alex's presence like gravity, pulling at something deep in her chest. The moment stretched, fragile as a soap bubble, until headlights cut through the gathering dusk. Margie's cherry-red SUV pulled up, tires crunching through fresh snow, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet evening. Reality crashed back like a physical blow. None of this was real, not the ring on her finger, not the way Alex looked at her, not the familiar comfort of having him beside her again. Clara stood quickly, grateful for the excuse to escape, even as part of her ache to stay.
I should see what Margie wants.
She didn't look back to see if Alex watched her go, afraid of what she might see in his face, or worse, what he might see in hers. Chapter 8: The Charity Gala. Alex pulled up to Clara's farmhouse, his heart already picking up rhythm. The evening ahead loomed with both promise and peril, a charity gala where they'd have to convince the entire town their engagement wasn't just tabloid fodder. He adjusted his bow tie, grateful for the familiar comfort of formal wear, even if it felt oddly stiff in Snowfall Ridge's casual atmosphere. The leather seats of his luxury car seemed suddenly too pristine against the backdrop of the weathered barn and snow-covered fields. The porch light cast a warm glow across the snow-dusted steps as he approached. Ancient Christmas lights, probably strung up decades ago, twinkled stubbornly along the eaves. Before he could knock, the door creaked open, and Alex forgot how to breathe. Clara stood in the doorway wearing her grandmother's vintage emerald green evening gown, the silk fabric catching the light like fresh pine needles after rain. Her auburn hair was swept up elegantly, exposing the graceful curve of her neck. A delicate gold necklace, one he remembered her grandmother always wearing, rested perfectly against her collarbone. For a moment, Alex was 17 again, picking her up for senior prom with sweaty palms and a heart full of genuine wonder.
You look exactly like you did at senior prom.
He managed, his voice rougher than intended. His fingers itched to brush away the loose curl that had escaped near her temple. A blush crept across her cheeks as she fiddled with the engagement ring, his ring, that she must have just slipped back on. The diamond caught the porch light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across her dress.
Is that a compliment, or should I be worried about my fashion choices?
Definitely a compliment.
He offered his arm, trying to ignore how natural it felt when she took it, how perfectly her hand settled into the crook of his elbow.
Ready to convince Snowfall Ridge we're madly in love.
Please.
Clara rolled her eyes, but her smile held a hint of something softer, something that made his chest tighten.
This town believes in Santa Claus. They'll believe anything.
The drive to Snowfall Inn was filled with comfortable silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under the car's tires and the soft hum of the heating system. Alex kept stealing glances at Clara, watching how the passing streetlights painted patterns across her profile. Her presence filled the car with the scent of her subtle perfume, something floral mixed with winter air. She caught him looking once and raised an eyebrow.
Eyes on the road, Mr. Gray. I'd hate to become a Christmas tragedy.
The inn's ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland. Crystal chandeliers dripped with silver icicles, while white frosted evergreen boughs lined the walls. The air sparkled with tiny snowflakes that drifted down from hidden machines above. Alex's hand found its way to the small of Clara's back as they entered, a gesture that felt both calculated and completely involuntary. Her warmth seeped through the silk of her dress, making his palm tingle. During dinner, they fell into an easy rhythm of shared jokes and casual touches. Clara laughed genuinely at his terrible pun about Christmas trees, and Alex found himself leaning closer just to catch the familiar scent of pine that always clung to her hair. The candlelight caught the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, mesmerizing him. She noticed his cufflinks, the silver ones she'd given him for graduation, and her fingers brushed his wrist, sending electricity up his arm.
They're still my favorites,
He said simply, watching her eyes soften at the admission. The truth of it surprised him. He owned dozens of more expensive pairs, yet these were the ones he reached for most often. The bubble of warmth burst when Victor's sharp voice cut through the festivities.
Alex. A word?
His business partner stood near the bar, tablet in hand and face set in grim lines. The screen's blue glow highlighted the tension in his jaw. Alex squeezed Clara's hand apologetically, before following Victor to a quiet corner. The familiar weight of corporate responsibility settled back onto his shoulders like a heavy coat, but the lingering warmth of Clara's touch made it somehow harder to bear than usual.
The board's pushing back on the merger timeline.
Victor launched in without preamble.
We need to move faster. Cut this small-town holiday charade short and get back to reality. The shareholders are getting restless, and our stock dropped 3 points this morning.
Alex's jaw tightened as he watched Clara across the room, now chatting with his mother. Eleanor was showing something on her phone that had Clara covering her mouth to stifle laughter, probably those embarrassing Christmas morning photos from his awkward preteen years. The one where he'd insisted on wearing his Superman pajamas to open presents still haunted him.
The merger can wait until after Christmas,
Alex said firmly, fighting the urge to loosen his bow tie. The weight of Victor's expectations felt suffocating.
The market won't.
I said it can wait.
His tone left no room for argument, though he knew this conversation was far from over. The orchestra struck up White Christmas, and Alex left Victor mid-protest, drawn back to Clara like a compass finding north. She fit perfectly in his arms as they moved onto the dance floor, her hand warm in his. The familiar scent of her vanilla perfume brought back a flood of memories he'd tried so hard to forget.
Remember the first time we danced to this?
He murmured near her ear.
Junior year, winter formal. You were wearing that blue dress with the snowflakes.
The memory was crystal clear, how nervous he'd been, how his palms had sweated.
And you stepped on my feet at least 3 times.
Clara finished, missing a step as she laughed. Her eyes crinkled at the corners just like they used to.
I was distracted by how beautiful you looked.
The words slipped out before he could catch them, too honest for their careful charade. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized how true they still were. They moved through the crowd until they ended up by the champagne table, reaching for glasses at the same time. A collective gasp from nearby guests made them both look up, directly at the sprig of mistletoe hanging above their heads. Alex silently cursed his mother's fondness for traditional holiday decorations. Kiss. 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 The chant spread through the ballroom like wildfire, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Alex's gaze dropped to Clara's lips, painted a soft rose that made them look impossibly kissable.
We should probably give them a show,
He said quietly, though his racing pulse had nothing to do with their audience. His fingers itched to pull her closer. Clara's hand crept up to his lapel, fingers curling into the fabric.
Probably.
Her voice was barely above a whisper. He cupped her face gently, thumb brushing her cheek as he leaned in. The first touch of their lips was soft, tentative, meant for show. But then Clara made a small sound in the back of her throat, and Alex was lost. His arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened. She tasted like champagne and possibilities, her lips moving against his with a familiarity that made his chest ache. For a moment, he forgot about Victor, the merger, everything except how right this felt. A wolf whistle pierced the moment, and they broke apart, both slightly breathless. Clara's lipstick was smudged, her cheeks flushed, and Alex had never seen anything more beautiful. He resisted the urge to kiss her again, right there in front of everyone. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of avoiding each other's eyes, while somehow being hyper-aware of every movement the other made. Alex caught Clara touching her lips more than once, and his own tingled with the memory of their kiss. He noticed Victor watching them with narrowed eyes from across the room. The drive back to the farm was silent, heavy with words neither of them seemed brave enough to voice. The crunch of gravel under his Italian leather shoes seemed deafening as Alex walked Clara to her door, opening his mouth to say something, anything, but the right words wouldn't come. She slipped inside with a quiet good night, leaving him standing in the cold, wondering if he'd just complicated their carefully constructed facade beyond repair. The warmth of her kiss lingered on his lips all the way back to his car. As he drove away, Alex couldn't stop touching his lips, chasing the ghost of a kiss that felt anything but fake. Chapter 9: Secrets and Scandals. Clara savored the quiet morning, watching snowflakes drift past her kitchen window. The farmhouse creaked softly around her as she lifted her favorite ceramic mug, the one with tiny painted evergreens her grandmother had given her, to her lips. Steam curled up from the dark liquid, carrying the rich aroma of the special holiday blend she'd been saving for Christmas week. The front door burst open with a bang that made her jump.
Clara! Oh my God, Clara!
Margie's voice carried through the house, followed by the sound of boots being kicked off in a hurry and the wet slap of her heavy winter coat hitting the floor.
In here,
Clara called, already tensing at her friend's urgent tone. Her stomach knotted with an inexplicable sense of dread. Margie skidded into the kitchen, her cheeks flushed from the cold, clutching her tablet like a shield. Wisps of blonde hair had escaped from beneath her knit cap, and her bright blue eyes were wide with panic.
You need to see this. Right now.
The tablet screen displayed a gossip site's homepage, dominated by a photo of Clara and Alex at the charity gala. It was the moment they'd shared their first dance, her emerald dress sparkling under the crystal chandeliers, his hand warm against her waist. The headline made her blood run cold: Tech Billionaire's fake engagement, the $500,000 Christmas deal. The mug slipped from Clara's numb fingers, shattering on the floor. Coffee splashed across her wool socks, but she barely noticed the burning sensation. Her eyes were glued to the article's opening paragraph, written by none other than Jessica Chen, Alex's ex-girlfriend, whose perfectly manicured claws had finally found their target. Sources close to the couple confirmed that Alex Gray orchestrated an elaborate PR stunt, paying local tree farmer Clara Evans $500,000 to pose as his fiancée through the holiday season. The farmhouse door slammed again, rattling the vintage Christmas ornaments on the windowsill. Alex appeared in the kitchen doorway, his usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and wild eyes. His cashmere sweater was inside out, and his dark hair stuck up at odd angles.
Clara, I can explain.
explain what?
Her voice came out eerily calm as she scrolled through Jessica's detailed exposé, each word feeling like a needle to her heart.
How you put a price tag on this?
She gestured between them, her hand trembling in the morning light that suddenly felt too harsh, too revealing. The landline started ringing, its shrill tone making her flinch. When it didn't stop, Clara yanked the cord from the wall, relishing the sudden silence that felt like a momentary shield against the world crumbling around her.
Those vultures work fast.
Margie muttered, peeking through the curtains at the growing commotion outside. Her breath fogged the glass as she counted.
There's already a whole pack of reporters at the gate. They're setting up cameras.
Clara joined her at the window, watching as Mrs. Jenkins, who'd been bringing her coffee cake every Sunday since Clara was a child, led a group of women away from the farm. Their disapproving headshakes and whispered conversations felt like physical blows, each one chipping away at the reputation she'd spent years building in this close-knit community. The crunch of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Victor Hart emerged from a sleek black car, his expression thunderous as he strode toward the house, his Italian leather shoes incongruous against the snow-dusted ground. He didn't bother knocking, simply pushed past Clara like she was invisible, leaving behind a cloud of expensive cologne that made her nose wrinkle.
The board meeting starts in an hour.
Victor snapped at Alex, his voice carrying through the old farmhouse walls.
This PR nightmare needs damage control. Now. The shareholders are in a panic.
Clara retreated to the greenhouse, her sanctuary since childhood, where she'd spent countless hours helping her grandmother tend to delicate seedlings and learning the patient rhythm of growing things. The humid air wrapped around her like a blanket as she moved between the poinsettias she'd been growing for holiday orders, their crimson leaves a stark contrast to the pristine white snow visible through the glass panels. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind her, a hesitant rhythm she'd grown to know well over the past weeks.
Clara, please.
Alex's voice was soft, pleading, nothing like the confident tone he used in business interviews.
Let me explain. It's not what you think.
She spun to face him, surprised by the fury burning in her chest, hot enough to rival the greenhouse heaters.
Was any of it real?
The question burst out before she could stop it, raw and painful.
Or was I just another business transaction?
She twisted the engagement ring off her finger, the diamond catching the weak winter sunlight and sending prisms dancing across the weathered wooden shelves. Alex's phone buzzed incessantly, the harsh electronic sound at odds with the peaceful sanctuary of growing things. She watched his face transform as he glanced at the screen, the warmth in his eyes replaced by the sharp calculation she'd seen in countless magazine photos, the mask of the billionaire sliding seamlessly into place. Outside, Margie's voice carried across the yard as she tried to reason with angry customers, her usually cheerful tone strained.
I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The Evans family has always been honest folk. We can't support dishonesty,
Mrs. Peterson declared loudly, her voice carrying clearly through the greenhouse glass.
Cancel our tree order. And to think I recommended this place to my daughter's wedding planner.
Clara's laptop chimed with new emails, the sound making her flinch. Her stomach dropped as she read the messages from the bank, questioning the stability of her loan application given the current scandal. The words high-risk investment and reconsidering terms blurred before her eyes.
Miss Evans.
Victor's cold voice made her jump. She hadn't heard him enter the greenhouse, his presence as unwelcome as frost on spring buds. He adjusted his silk tie with manicured fingers.
I'd like to discuss terms for a quieter resolution to this situation.
He named a figure that made her ears ring, enough money to save the farm 10 times over.
Get out.
Clara's voice shook with rage, her fingers curling into fists at her sides.
Get off my property. Both of you.
Think about it.
Victor pressed.
Alex has always had a talent for turning scandals into opportunities. This is no different.
His smile was practiced, predatory, reminding Clara of the business sharks she'd seen on late-night television. Clara watched numbly as Alex packed his bag in the farmhouse kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd shared hot chocolate just days ago, laughing about old memories. Neither spoke as he moved around the room, gathering his things with mechanical precision. The silence felt like glass, one wrong move would shatter it completely. She wanted to scream, to demand explanations, but her throat had closed up tight. His car pulled away 10 minutes later, swarmed by reporters who'd somehow gotten past the gate, their voices carrying across the snowy grounds like hungry crows. Clara stood at her grandmother's window, still clutching the engagement ring that now felt like ice against her palm. The antique lace curtains, yellowed with age, couldn't hide the chaos unfolding on her driveway. The note she found on the kitchen counter was brief. I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. His normally precise handwriting was rushed, uneven. The paper crumpled in her fist as the first tears finally fell, hot and angry against her cheeks. She could taste their bitterness on her lips. Outside, camera flashes continued to light up the winter morning like artificial lightning, transforming her peaceful sanctuary into a circus. Each burst of light illuminated the Christmas wreaths she'd hung just yesterday, their cheerful red ribbons now seeming to mock her pain. Chapter 9: The Rift. Alex stared at his hotel room wall at the Snowfall Inn, the screen of his phone lighting up for the 100th time that morning. The display cast an eerie blue glow across the room's antique wallpaper, each new message from the PR team more urgent than the last. His head throbbed from too much coffee and too little rest, while outside his window the cheerful holiday decorations seemed to mock his predicament. A commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Mrs. Jenkins' worried voice carried through the door, her usually cheerful tone now anxious.
Miss Evans, perhaps we should.
The door burst open. Clara stood there, pine sap streaking her work coat, her cheeks flushed from either the cold or anger, probably both. She clutched a stack of papers to her chest, her knuckles white. The sight of her made his stomach clench with guilt and something deeper, more complicated.
Clara, I can explain.
She hurled the papers at him with enough force to make him step back. They scattered across the room like autumn leaves, each headline a fresh accusation. Tech billionaire's fake engagement scandal splashed across the Boston Globe. Snowfall Ridge romance all for show? Mocked from the local paper, and worst of all, their charity gala photo dissected in painful detail by every gossip site from here to California.
Explain what exactly?
Clara's voice shook.
How Jessica leaked our little arrangement to every tabloid from here to New York. Or how about explaining why my grandmother's farm is now being called a desperate gold digger's last resort on social media?
Her words hit him like physical blows, each one perfectly aimed at his conscience. Alex stepped toward her, his chest tight with the desperate need to make this right.
Jessica did this to hurt me, not you. I never thought.
That's right. You never thought.
Clara ran her fingers through her hair, dislodging pine needles that scattered across the plush carpet.
You never thought about how this would affect me, my business, my reputation in this town. My grandmother built that farm from nothing, Alex. She worked herself to the bone so people would respect our family name. And now.
A sharp knock interrupted them. Victor entered without waiting for a response, his tablet already extended, radiating his usual efficiency that now felt jarringly out of place.
Alex, the numbers are getting worse. We're looking at a potential 15% drop in stock value when the markets open. The board is...
He paused, noticing Clara.
Miss Evans. I wasn't aware you were here.
Alex watched Clara's face as he took the tablet, saw the moment her expression shifted from hurt to something harder, more distant. He recognized that look. He'd seen it the day he'd told her he was leaving for college early, choosing his future over their plans. The memory twisted in his gut like a knife.
Clara, just give me a minute to handle this.
She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled tree order form, their original contract written in his hasty scrawl. With deliberate movements, she tore it in half, then quarters. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room.
Consider our deal terminated.
Let me fix this,
Alex said, setting the tablet aside despite Victor's sharp intake of breath. His fingers itched to pick it back up, to handle this crisis the way he handled everything else, through carefully crafted press releases and strategic decisions.
Jessica's been trying to sabotage me since our breakup. This isn't about you.
That's exactly the problem.
Clara's laugh held no humor, the sound scraping against his nerves like sandpaper.
You used my desperation to solve your PR problem. And now you're using it again to explain away this mess. I was just a convenient solution, wasn't I? The hometown girl who could give you the perfect Christmas cover story?
That's not.
The words stuck in his throat, because wasn't that exactly how this had started? A business arrangement, pure and simple. He hadn't counted on the way his heart would complicate things. She pulled off the engagement ring, the diamond catching the morning light one last time before she set it on his desk with a soft clink. The sound hit him harder than her shouting had, each facet of the stone seeming to mock him with memories of the night he'd placed it on her finger. His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. The board chairman's name flashed insistently, each letter a reminder of the empire he'd built. Clara's eyes tracked the movement, her jaw tightening with each vibration, until Alex finally silenced it completely, though the action felt like sawing off his own arm.
You know what the worst part is?
She wrapped her arms around herself, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her.
I actually started believing it might be real this time. That maybe you'd finally learned how to stay instead of run.
I left because I had dreams, Clara. Goals.
His voice took on the defensive edge he used in board meetings.
The same ones that built this company.
The company that's more important than anything else.
She gestured to his silent phone, each movement sharp with accusation.
Than anyone else.
Victor cleared his throat, producing a thick document from his briefcase with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel.
Speaking of the company, the board has issued an ultimatum. They need you back in the city immediately, Alex. Your position as CEO depends on it.
The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. Alex stared at the contract, his throat tight. Every instinct honed over years of business deals told him to sign it, to protect what he'd built. But Clara's presence felt like a weight on his chest, making it hard to think clearly. The familiar signature line seemed to blur before his eyes, transforming from a simple dotted line into an impassable chasm. She watched him, something knowing and sad crossing her face. The expression reminded him of that summer day years ago, when she'd watched him pack his car for college.
You haven't changed at all,
she said softly, each word falling like snow on his shoulders.
Still running away when things get complicated. At least this time I'm prepared for it.
The door clicked shut behind her with crushing finality. Alex moved to the window, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name, watching as she crossed the parking lot to her truck. Her shoulders were set in that familiar, determined way, though he could see the slight tremor in her steps. The engagement ring felt heavy in his palm. When had he picked it up? The diamond caught the winter light, a mockery of all the promises they'd almost made. On his desk, 2 documents waited for his signature, the board's contract demanding his return, and a draft press release that would absolve Clara of any wrongdoing by taking full responsibility for the deception. It would likely tank the company's reputation, possibly his career. Years of carefully cultivated business relationships would crumble, and Victor would never forgive him. The thought should have terrified him more than it did. Through the window, Clara's truck disappeared around the corner, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow. Alex closed his fingers around the ring, feeling the edges dig into his palm. The metal warmed against his skin, a constant reminder of everything he stood to lose, and everything he might have already lost. The silence in his office felt deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the heating system and his own uneven breathing. Chapter 11, A Heartfelt Realization. Alex stared at the wall of screens in his penthouse office, each one displaying variations of the same nightmare. Stock tickers scrolled past in angry red, headlines screamed about corporate instability, and social media erupted with speculation about his personal life. His hand drifted to his coat pocket for the 100th time that morning, searching for a ring that wasn't there. The familiar weight of its absence felt like another failure adding to the mounting pressure. The city sprawled beneath his window, a concrete jungle so different from the snow-dusted pines of Snowfall Ridge. He'd chosen this office for its view, but now the sleek glass and steel felt like a prison. His coffee had gone cold, lacking the comforting warmth of Clara's homemade hot chocolate. He could almost taste the hint of cinnamon she always added, a secret recipe passed down from her grandmother.
The PR team has drafted 3 possible statements.
His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, efficient and emotionless.
And Mr. Hart is requesting your presence in the emergency board meeting. He's mentioned it's particularly urgent.
Alex pressed his fingertips against his temples, feeling the beginnings of what promised to be a crushing headache.
Tell them I'll be there in 5.
The boardroom buzzed with tension when he arrived, Victor's presentation already in full swing. Graphs and projections filled the screen, each one more dire than the last. Alex settled into his chair, opening his leather portfolio more out of habit than necessity. The leather still held that new car smell, a recent gift from some tech conference he barely remembered attending.
If we implement aggressive damage control measures immediately,
Victor's laser pointer danced across charts, his voice carrying that smugness that had always grated on Alex's nerves.
we can minimize the impact on Q4 earnings.
Alex's pen moved across his notepad, but instead of the usual strategic bullets, he found himself sketching evergreen trees. The first came out too symmetrical, nothing like the charmingly lopsided one he and Clara had cut down during their senior year. He'd insisted they needed the perfect tree for the winter formal committee. Clara had laughed, dragging him through knee-deep snow until they found one that was perfectly imperfect. Her cheeks had been flushed from the cold, snowflakes caught in her eyelashes.
Alex.
Victor's sharp tone cut through the memory, carrying a note of barely concealed irritation.
Your thoughts on the strategy?
He looked up to find the entire board watching him expectantly. The tree sketch mocked him from the page, branches reaching toward nothing. A dozen faces waited for his response, each carrying varying degrees of concern and judgment.
I think we need a break.
Alex said, standing abruptly. His chair squeaked against the polished floor.
30 minutes.
He escaped to his private bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. His reflection looked foreign, perfectly tailored suit, carefully styled hair, designer watch catching the light. Success wrapped around him like armor, but it felt hollow now. Droplets of water clung to his jawline, and for a moment, he remembered how snowflakes had felt on his skin back in Snowfall Ridge. The company holiday party that evening was worse. Champagne flowed freely, deals were struck between appetizer courses, and everyone wanted a piece of him. Alex moved through the crowd on autopilot, nodding at the right moments, shaking hands when required. But his mind kept drifting to another party, where fairy lights had twinkled in Clara's hair as they danced. The memory of her laugh echoed clearer than the string quartet playing in the corner. He found himself in a quiet corner, phone in hand. The photos from the charity gala filled his screen, Clara in that green dress that made her eyes spark like fireworks, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. His thumb hovered over the delete button, but he couldn't bring himself to erase them. Each image held a piece of happiness he hadn't even realized he'd been missing.
Alex, darling.
A socialite whose name he should probably remember air-kissed his cheek, leaving behind a cloud of expensive perfume that made him long for the simple scent of pine needles.
That whole engagement drama must have been absolutely dreadful. But you're better off without all that small-town baggage.
The words hit him like a physical blow. He thought of Clara's farm, of the way she'd light up talking about her grandmother's legacy. Of morning coffee in her cozy kitchen, watching snow fall outside while she reviewed supplier contracts with the same dedication he gave to million-dollar deals. The memory of her determination made his chest ache.
Actually,
He said, surprising himself with the edge in his voice.
Snowfall Ridge has more authenticity in one street than this entire city.
The truth of it settled in his bones, heavy and undeniable. The socialite's perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up. Before she could respond, Victor appeared at his elbow, his presence as unwelcome as always.
The Tokyo investors are ready for our call,
He said, steering Alex toward the elevator with a grip that brooked no argument.
We need to reassure them about the company's stability.
Alex glanced down at his phone one last time. In the photo, Clara was looking at him with an expression he hadn't fully appreciated at the time, something soft and real that had nothing to do with their arrangement. He'd been too busy playing his part to notice she might not have been acting at all. The way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the slight curve of her lips, it spoke of something genuine that he'd missed completely in his determination to keep things professional. Alex stood at his office window, the city sprawling beneath him like a circuit board of light and shadow. Endless streams of headlights crawled through the streets, so different from the warm, twinkling Christmas lights he and Clara had strung across the farm's fence posts. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, remembering how she'd laughed when he'd tangled himself in a string of lights, how her nose had scrunched up as she'd untangled him with practiced ease. The memory of her fingers brushing against his coat sleeve sent an unexpected shiver through him. His phone buzzed, another message from Victor about damage control. Alex ignored it, his attention caught by a holiday display in the building across the street. The artificial tree in their lobby reminded him of everything wrong with his current life: perfect, symmetrical, soulless. Just like the carefully curated image he'd built for himself over the years, sacrificing authenticity for the sake of success. Before he could second-guess himself, he pulled up his travel app. 3 clicks later, his flight to Snowfall Ridge was booked for tomorrow morning. His heart raced with the impulsivity of the decision, but it felt right in a way board meetings and investor calls hadn't in weeks. The thought of returning made his palms sweat like a teenager's, but the nervous energy coursing through him felt more alive than he'd been in months. The scene shifted in his mind to Clara, probably driving past the Snowfall Inn right now in her beat-up truck. He could picture her slowing down, maybe glancing up at his old room, now empty. Mrs. Jenkins would be there, probably shaking her head with that knowing look she'd perfected over decades of watching town drama unfold. He could almost hear the innkeeper's gentle tut-tut, the same sound she'd made when he'd left town years ago. Alex's hand drifted to his wallet, fingers finding the worn edge of paper he'd carried for years. He pulled out Clara's grandmother's cookie recipe, its corners soft and creased from countless foldings and unfoldings. The handwriting had faded, but he could still make out the extra note in the margin. "Remember, Alex dear, the secret ingredient is patience." The paper still held a faint trace of cinnamon, or maybe that was just his imagination playing tricks on him. He smoothed the recipe on his desk, remembering the day she'd given it to him. "You're the only one besides Clara who gets this," she'd said, her eyes twinkling. "Some things are worth waiting for." He traced the loops of her handwriting, remembering how she'd squeezed his hand when she'd pressed the paper into it. God, he'd been such an idiot. He'd carried this recipe through college, through building his company, through every relationship that followed. Even during his highest-profile romance, he'd kept this piece of paper tucked away, unable to let it go. Unable to let her go. It had become his talisman, a reminder of everything he'd left behind in pursuit of his ambitions. Moving to his apartment's balcony, Alex pulled in a deep breath of cold night air. A pine cone sat on the small table. He'd absently pocketed it during that last walk around Clara's farm. He picked it up now, running his fingers over its scales, feeling the sticky remnants of sap that still clung to its surface. The stars above the city were faint, obscured by light pollution and smog, but he knew they were the same ones shining over Snowfall Ridge. Over Clara. He imagined her on her farmhouse porch, maybe wrapped in that old college sweatshirt she'd never returned. His sweatshirt. The thought made his chest ache. The worn gray fabric would still be too big on her. The university logo faded from countless washes, but she'd probably still roll up the sleeves just like she used to, determined to make it work. Back inside, Alex cleared his desk with one sweep of his arm. Corporate reports and PR strategies scattered, making way for blank paper. The first letter started formally.
Dear Clara.
Too stiff. The second began with,
I'm sorry.
but the words that followed felt insufficient. The third tried to explain the business pressures, the media circus, but came across as justification rather than truth. He'd never been good at putting feelings to paper. Spreadsheets and contracts were more his territory now. Hours passed. Crumpled attempts littered his floor like snowdrifts, each one a failed attempt to capture what his heart wanted to say. His hand cramped, ink stained his fingers black and blue like bruises, but still the right words eluded him. The city lights flickered beyond his window, a poor imitation of the Christmas decorations back home. How could he explain that leaving Snowfall Ridge the first time had been his biggest mistake? That success felt empty without someone real to share it with? That pretending to be engaged had felt more genuine than any actual relationship he'd had since her? Each question felt heavier than the last. His phone lit up with calendar reminders, the harsh blue glow cutting through the warm lamplight of his office. The investor meeting tomorrow would make or break their Asian expansion. Victor had been preparing for months, drilling numbers and projections until they could recite them in their sleep. The board was counting on him. His empire needed its emperor. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Alex stared at the notification for a long moment, then swiped left to decline. Let Victor handle it. Some things were more important than quarterly projections and market share. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it felt like freedom. He looked down at his latest attempt at the letter, reading the words aloud to the empty room, his voice rough with emotion.
The truth is, Clara, I never stopped carrying you with me. Like this recipe in my wallet, like the memory of Christmas lights in your eyes, like the way you always saw past my walls to who I really was. I'm tired of pretending. Tired of being the person everyone expects me to be, instead of the person you once believed I could become.
It still wasn't perfect, but maybe that was the point. Perfect wasn't real. Real was messy and complicated and worth fighting for. Like Clara's crooked Christmas trees that somehow had more character than any perfectly manicured one. Like her grandmother's handwritten recipe, complete with coffee stains and crossed-out measurements. Like love itself. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket alongside the recipe. Tomorrow he'd board a plane back to Snowfall Ridge, back to Clara, back to everything that mattered. Tonight, though, he stepped onto his balcony one more time, holding the pine cone and looking up at those distant stars, hoping somehow Clara was doing the same. The cold air bit at his cheeks, but he welcomed it, a preview of the mountain winter waiting for him at home. Chapter 12, A Winter's Proposal. Clara brushed snow from her gloves, watching her last customer of the season navigate their station wagon down the winding driveway. The tiny Douglas fir strapped to their roof looked almost comical, probably a apartment dweller's compromise. Still, a sale was a sale, even if this season's numbers were far from ideal. She'd have to crunch the depressing figures tomorrow, after all the holiday festivities had passed. Soft flakes drifted through the twilight, catching in her hair as she made her final rounds. The barn's weathered walls glowed amber from the string lights she'd hung years ago, back when Grandma insisted every corner of the farm should sparkle like Christmas itself. Those lights had stayed up year-round ever since, though Clara only plugged them in during December. Sometimes she caught herself reaching for the switch in July, muscle memory refusing to let go.
Just you and me now,
She murmured to the remaining trees, their branches heavy with fresh powder. The empty silence pressed in, making her chest ache. Christmas Eve had always been magical here. The rush of last-minute shoppers, Grandma's hot chocolate station, the whole family gathering to sing carols after closing. Now it just felt hollow. She could almost smell the phantom scent of Grandma's special cocoa recipe, rich with real chocolate and a hint of cinnamon that she'd never quite managed to replicate. A truck's engine rumbled in the distance. Clara frowned, checking her phone. No missed calls or texts about late pickups. Besides, she'd posted the holiday hours everywhere, closed at sunset on Christmas Eve. The sound grew closer, gravel crunching under tires. Her fingers tightened around her phone, wondering if she should call Sheriff Mulligan just in case. Her heart stumbled when she recognized the driver. Alex parked near the barn entrance, but didn't immediately get out. Through the windshield, she could see him gripping the steering wheel, head bowed like he was gathering courage. Gone was his usual sleek suit and perfect hair. Instead, he wore a flannel shirt she remembered from their teenage years, rolled up at the sleeves despite the cold. The sight of it made her throat tight. She'd borrowed that shirt once, on a chilly autumn evening that ended with their first kiss.
we're closed.
She called out, hating how her voice wavered. But Alex was already climbing down from the cab, his old work boots, the same ones he'd worn that first summer job, leaving fresh tracks in the snow. Each crunching step seemed to echo in her chest, stirring up memories she'd tried so hard to bury. He looked different. Softer somehow, without his corporate armor. A small, rather messily wrapped tree was tucked under one arm, its branches slightly crushed on one side. The twine around it was knotted awkwardly, the way he used to tie it before she taught him the proper technique.
I remember this spot.
He said quietly, stopping in the barn doorway.
16 years old, scared out of my mind about screwing up my first day. Then this girl with pine sap in her hair told me I was holding the shears wrong.
His voice carried that familiar warmth that used to make her feel like the only person in his world.
You were going to take your thumb off.
The memory surfaced unbidden, Alex's nervous smile, the way he'd blushed when she. Clara crossed her arms, fighting the urge to step closer, to breathe in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with winter air.
If this is another business proposition.
It's not.
He reached into his jacket, pulling out a folder with careful, deliberate movements that reminded her of how he used to handle delicate saplings.
Well, not exactly. This is for you, no strings attached. Whether you want anything to do with me or not.
She took the papers with trembling fingers, trying to ignore how the slight brush of his hand against hers sent warmth spreading up her arm. Legal documents, something about a conservation trust. As she scanned the details, her eyes widened, heart beginning to race.
This would protect the farm forever?
The whole property. Margie helped me connect with local investors who care about preserving Snowfall Ridge's heritage. The trust ensures the land can never be developed and provides operating funds for sustainable Christmas tree farming.
He shuffled his feet, suddenly looking young again, like the boy who'd helped her string lights in this very spot.
Your grandmother's legacy will be safe.
But why would you?
Clara stopped, noticing more papers beneath the first. Familiar letterhead from his company caught her eye, the glossy logo she'd seen splashed across business magazines at the grocery store.
I stepped down.
Alex said simply.
Transferred majority control to the board. Kept enough shares to be comfortable, but...
He shrugged, and Clara caught a glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes that made her breath catch.
Turns out being a tech billionaire isn't all that fulfilling when you're alone in a penthouse every night.
Alex.
I bought Miller's consulting firm instead. The little one downtown. It's enough to keep me busy, help local businesses grow. And...
He smiled crookedly, the same smile that used to make her knees weak during stolen moments between farm chores.
The commute's a lot better.
Snow swirled between them, catching in the Christmas lights and creating halos of gold around them both. Clara's mind raced, trying to process everything. The Alex she'd known these past weeks, polished, guarded, always calculating, had vanished. In his place stood the boy she'd fallen for all those years ago, with his quiet intensity and crooked smile that spoke of summer days and whispered promises.
Walk with me,
he asked softly, his voice carrying that hint of uncertainty she remembered from their first date.
There's something else I want to show you.
Her feet moved before she could think better of it, before her walls could spring back up. They wound through the rows of trees, their shoulders occasionally brushing, each touch sending sparks through her winter coat. The snow was falling faster now, muffling their footsteps and transforming the farm into a dreamy wonderland that reminded her of every Christmas card she'd ever seen.
I told myself I left because I had bigger dreams.
Alex said as they walked, his words forming little clouds in the frigid air.
That success meant corner offices and magazine covers. But every achievement felt hollow. Every relationship failed because I was comparing them all to one summer when everything made sense.
Clara's throat tightened, memories flooding back of lazy afternoons and shared dreams beneath swaying branches. She knew exactly which tree they were heading for, an ancient blue spruce that had been too gorgeous to sell year after year. Their tree, where they'd carved their initials so small only they knew where to find them.
I kept trying to fill this emptiness with more success, more acquisitions.
Alex stopped beneath the spruce's snow-laden branches, the same spot where he'd first kissed her.
But the only time I've felt truly alive recently was helping you stack firewood and arguing about proper tree trimming technique.
You still hold the shears wrong.
Clara managed, her voice rough with unshed tears and years of buried feelings. His laugh was soft and warm, wrapping around her like a favorite blanket.
I know. And I hope you'll have plenty of chances to keep correcting me.
He turned to face her fully, snowflakes catching in his dark hair.
If you'll let me stay.
Clara's heart thundered in her chest as she stared at Alex under their tree, snowflakes swirling around them like stardust. The raw honesty in his expression both thrilled and terrified her. She'd been here before, believing in promises that dissolved like morning frost. But something in his eyes now spoke of roots growing deep, of weathering storms together instead of running from them.
You say you want to stay now.
She managed, her voice catching.
But you left before. Without even saying goodbye.
The words she'd held back for years finally spilled out, each one carrying the weight of countless sleepless nights and tear-stained pillows.
One day you were here talking about our future and the next, nothing. Just headlines about the brilliant Alex Gray conquering Silicon Valley.
Alex reached for his coat again, pulling out a worn leather portfolio that looked as though it had traveled thousands of miles.
I never really left, Clara.
He opened it carefully, revealing dozens of newspaper clippings, their edges softened with age and frequent handling.
Every article about the farm, every seasonal feature, every community award you won, I kept them all.
Clara's fingers trembled as she touched a yellowed clipping from 5 years ago. Local tree farm continues holiday tradition under new management. Her grandmother's funeral had been just weeks before that piece ran, and the memory of that lonely winter still ached in her chest like a fresh wound.
I saw this one,
She whispered, tracing the familiar words.
Someone anonymous donated enough to cover that season's operating costs. That was you?
Her mind raced back to that desperate December, when she'd thought she'd lose everything. He nodded, turning pages to reveal more memories preserved in newsprint, each one a silent witness to the years they'd spent apart.
I convinced myself you were better off without me. That I'd only hold you back from running the farm your way. But I couldn't stop caring, couldn't stop following your story from afar.
You incredible idiot,
Clara said, tears finally spilling over hot against her wind-chilled cheeks.
I didn't need your money or your distance. I needed you.
Alex shifted, starting to lower himself to one knee in the deepening snow, but Clara grabbed his arm, her heart racing.
Oh no, you don't. Not yet.
She had to laugh at his startled expression, so reminiscent of their teenage years.
I have things to say first.
Clara.
My turn.
She took a shaky breath, gripping his forearms through the expensive wool of his coat.
I was so angry when you left that I let it calcify into pride. I could have reached out, could have demanded answers. Instead, I wrapped myself in stubbornness like armor. Told myself I didn't need anyone, especially you.
Snow gathered on Alex's shoulders as he listened, his eyes never leaving her face. The Christmas lights from the barn cast golden shadows across his features, softening them into the boy she'd once known so well.
But these past weeks,
Clara continued, her voice growing stronger.
Watching you rediscover this place, seeing you care about the farm and the town, I realized something. That angry girl who pushed everyone away. She was just scared. Scared of losing something precious again.
Alex's hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. The gentle touch sent warmth spreading through her, despite the December chill.
Clara Evans.
He started, then laughed softly.
I had this whole speech planned. Practiced it in front of my mirror like a teenager. But standing here now.
He sank to one knee, snow immediately soaking through his expensive jeans.
Nothing I rehearsed matters. What matters is that every success felt hollow because you weren't there to share it. What matters is that helping you stack firewood makes me happier than closing million-dollar deals.
He fumbled in his pocket, producing a ring that caught the Christmas lights like captured stars.
What matters is that I'm finally home, if you'll have me.
A muffled squeak came from behind a nearby Fraser fir, followed by the distinct sound of boots crunching in snow. Clara glanced over to see a familiar blonde head ducking behind the branches, phone held high. Leave it to Margie to document this moment, whether Clara wanted her to or not.
Margie Harris,
She called out, laughter bubbling up despite her attempts to sound stern.
I can see you.
Her best friend popped up from behind the tree, blonde curls dusted with snow, unrepentant as always.
Like I'd miss this. Keep going, pretend I'm not here.
She waved her phone enthusiastically, nearly dropping it in her excitement. Alex was still on his knee, snow soaking through his expensive jeans, looking up at Clara with equal parts amusement and adoration. His gray eyes sparkled in the Christmas lights strung overhead.
I'm trying to propose here,
He said, mock stern.
if you don't mind.
Clara turned back to him, her heart so full it hurt, warmth spreading through her chest despite the December chill.
Ask me properly then.
Clara Evans, love of my life, corrector of my terrible shearing technique, will you marry me? For real this time, no contracts or pretense. Just us, building a life together right here where we belong.
His voice caught slightly on the last words, and Clara felt tears prick at her eyes.
Yes,
She whispered, then louder,
yes.
Her voice echoed across the snow-covered farm that had brought them back together. The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, warm from being kept in Alex's pocket. The diamond caught the twinkling lights above, but Clara barely had time to admire it before he stood and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of snowflakes and joy. Behind them, Margie whooped loudly, no longer bothering to hide, the sound carrying across the silent evening. The moment was broken by the clear peal of bells from St. Michael's church tower, the familiar sound making Clara's heart skip. She pulled back, startled to see lights bobbing through the trees, dozens of them moving closer through the darkness. Voices rose in harmony, carrying the first notes of Silent Night through the snowy evening, the melody weaving through the branches of her beloved trees.
Is that?
Alex started, his arm tightening around her waist.
The entire town,
Clara confirmed, recognizing Mrs. Jenkins's distinctive soprano leading the chorus. She'd heard that voice at every Christmas festival since childhood.
How did they?
She shot a look at Margie, who was typing furiously on her phone, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement.
I may have sent a few texts,
her friend admitted, bouncing on her toes.
And Martha at the diner might have spread the word. And possibly Sheriff Joe helped coordinate timing with the bell tower.
She didn't look the least bit sorry about orchestrating the whole thing. The carolers emerged from the trees like a Christmas card come to life, bearing lanterns and thermoses of what smelled suspiciously like Margie's famous hot chocolate, the rich scent of cocoa and cinnamon mixing with the crisp winter air. Mrs. Jenkins winked as she conducted, her red scarf flying, never missing a note. Clara leaned into Alex's side, his arm warm and solid around her waist, feeling truly at home for the first time in years.
Still want to stay in this nosy, interfering small town?
He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice low and just for her, breath warm against her skin.
This time it's real. All of it. The farm, the town, us, I'm not going anywhere.
She squeezed his hand, feeling the cool press of her new ring, the metal already warming to her skin.
Good. Because I have years of tree trimming techniques to teach you.
The carolers launched into Joy to the World, as snow continued to fall, transforming the farm into a wonderland of light and song, and second chances finally made right. Clara watched the flakes dance in the lantern light, knowing that this Christmas would be the first of many they'd share among these beloved trees. Epilogue: Christmas at the Farm. Clara woke to the gentle tap of snowflakes against her bedroom window. The pre-dawn darkness held a peculiar glow, and as she pushed back the curtains, her breath caught. Hundreds of lanterns dotted the pathways through the tree farm, their warm light reflecting off the fresh snow. Strings of twinkling white lights wrapped around tree trunks and draped between branches, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical. That impossible man, she whispered, already reaching for her coat and boots. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet as she hurried down, pausing only to grab her grandmother's old plaid scarf from its hook. The moment she stepped outside, the crisp winter air filled her lungs. Clara followed the illuminated path, her boots crunching in the fresh powder. Around the bend, she stopped short. There, beneath the farm's entrance arch, sat her grandmother's vintage red pickup truck, not the rusted heap that had been slowly decomposing behind the barn, but a perfectly restored version of its former glory. A massive red bow adorned the hood, and the truck bed overflowed with fresh wreaths, their pine scent mingling with the morning air. Merry Christmas. Alex emerged from behind the truck, two steaming mugs in hand. His gray eyes crinkled at the corners as he took in her expression. Tommy from high school did the restoration. We've been working on it nights for the past week. He handed her a mug of cocoa, complete with tiny marshmallows floating on top, then guided her attention to the farm's main sign. The familiar wooden board had been lovingly restored, the lettering crisp and fresh against the dark wood, Evans and Gray Family Christmas Tree Farm. Clara's eyes stung with tears. You added your name. If that's okay, Alex said softly. I thought, since we're partners now in every way. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching cars broke through the morning quiet. Headlights cut through the lingering dawn as what seemed like half the town arrived, their cars laden with covered dishes and holiday decorations. The farm transformed from peaceful sanctuary to bustling celebration in a matter of minutes. Mrs. Jenkins took command immediately, her voice carrying across the snowy grounds. The tables go under the pavilion, mind the ice. And those wreaths need to be hung properly, symmetrically, people. She paused in her directives to pat both Alex and Clara's cheeks. I knew it all along, you know. Anyone with eyes could see you two belong together. Clara caught Alex's gaze and rolled her eyes good-naturedly. He responded with an exaggerated wink that made her laugh, the simple exchange carrying the weight of their shared history and future promises. The morning unfolded like a well-choreographed dance. Margie set up an elaborate cookie display that told their story in sugar and icing, tiny Christmas trees, a miniature version of the farm's truck, and even a cookie newspaper announcing local girl tames billionaire in delicate script. The centerpiece was a small cookie shaped like an engagement ring, decorated with silver dragées that sparkled in the lantern light. As the winter sun climbed higher, the farm hummed with activity and laughter. Alex moved through the crowd with easy confidence, demonstrating the new digital ordering system he'd designed. Clara couldn't help but smile as she watched him patiently explain the features to Mr. Peterson, who'd been buying his trees the same way for 30 years. See here, Alex explained, you can actually view a 3D model of each tree before you visit and reserve the one you want. The older man's skeptical expression gradually gave way to genuine interest as neighborhood kids gathered around, already pulling out their phones to download the app. Meanwhile, Clara led tours through the restored barn, now transformed into a cozy event space. Exposed wooden beams twinkled with strands of white lights, creating an atmosphere that had already prompted several inquiries about spring wedding bookings. Each time she caught Alex's eye across the crowd, her heart did a little flip. He looked so natural here now, his expensive coat dusted with snow as he helped carry chairs, his smile genuine as he reconnected with old neighbors. The winter sun traced its arc across the sky, and the celebration evolved with the changing light. Children built snowmen between the trees, while their parents shared stories over steaming cups of cider. The scent of pine mingled with wood smoke from the bonfire, where the high school choir had gathered to practice. Their voices carried across the snow-covered grounds, Christmas carols floating on the crisp afternoon air. Remember when that was us? Alex murmured in Clara's ear as they watched the teenagers arrange themselves by height. Though if I recall correctly, someone kept deliberately throwing off my solos. Clara laughed, leaning back against his chest. You were sharp on every other note. I was doing everyone a favor. Harsh, Evans. Very harsh. His arms tightened around her waist as the first notes of Silent Night filled the air. They stood together, watching their breath form little clouds in the growing dusk, while memories of their own choir days, including that first stolen kiss behind the church, wrapped around them like a warm blanket. As afternoon deepened into evening, the fairy lights throughout the farm began to twinkle more brightly against the darkening sky. The crowd gradually shifted toward the massive evergreen in the center of the farm's courtyard, drawn by the promise of the annual tree lighting ceremony. Clara felt the familiar flutter of excitement in her chest, the same one she'd had every year since she was small enough to ride on her father's shoulders. Ready? She called out, her hand on the ancient electrical box that had powered 30 years of Christmas celebrations. A chorus of excited voices answered back. She threw the switch, and the giant tree blazed to life, thousands of white lights reflecting off fresh snow. The collective gasp of wonder made her chest tight with emotion. Alex stepped forward, raising his glass of mulled cider. To Clara Evans, he announced, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, who reminded me what coming home really means. His eyes found hers across the crowd, full of warmth and promise. And to all of you who welcomed me back to Snowfall Ridge, even if some of you took a little convincing. This earned a ripple of knowing laughter. Later, as the party moved into the barn for dancing, Clara found herself twirling in Alex's arms beneath the twinkling lights. The old radio in the corner played, "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," and she could hear Margie's distinctive laugh mixing with the general merriment. Happy? Alex asked softly, pulling her closer. Clara looked around at their transformed barn, at their friends and neighbors dancing and laughing, at the restored truck visible through the open doors, at the sign that now bore both their names. But mostly she looked at Alex, at the man who'd left and come back, who'd changed and yet stayed the same in all the ways that mattered. More than, she whispered, stretching up to kiss him. The fairy lights sparkled overhead like stars, and outside, snow continued to fall gently on their little corner of Snowfall Ridge, where a billionaire had found his way home and a Christmas tree farmer had found her happy ending. Thank you for listening to my book. I hope you enjoyed it, and please comment and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Visit me at https://winvalentine.com to stay up to date.